Did you guys know there have been different animals throughout history that people thought were extinct and then they were just randomly sighted in the wild in remote areas in the world? Today we're going to be talking about this iceberg chart right here about animals that came back from extinction. Of course, we'll be talking about more well-known things such as the Coelacanth, the Thylacine, and then further down we're getting into more obscure topics such as the Ice Age pig that they found, the Takahe, an entire species that was living underneath one bush, and even companies that are claiming that they're going to try to bring back the woolly mammoth. Anyways, if you guys like animals and learning about ones that have gone extinct and been rediscovered, then sit back, relax, and we will go ahead and get into this video. Starting off with tier 1, we have gray wolves. So most people don't know about this, but gray wolves actually almost went extinct after European settlers arrived in America and they started blaming their livestock losses on wolves. And so because of this, they had multiple centuries of extreme hunting where they had decades of government extermination programs where they would poison and trap and do these large-scale organized hunts that were explicitly designed to wipe out wolves. Now, by the mid-1900s, wolves were actually eliminated from the lower 48 states here in the US, which is, all the states other than like Alaska, and obviously Hawaii is not included. Now, at one point, they believed that there was only a few hundred wolves left, probably like 300 individuals that were just living in northern Minnesota. But in the mid-1900s, they started repopulation efforts where they got the numbers up to about 60,000 in North America and about 5,500 in the lower 48. Now in modern day, I'm sure you guys have heard of this, there is this extremely controversial plan where they're trying to reintroduce different gray wolf packs around the US, especially in Colorado. And they established 4 packs in Colorado, but it's very controversial because ranchers and farmers that have livestock are now dealing with this new predator that hasn't been there in a really long time. And anyways, in 2026, they actually stopped because of some legal issues they had going on. And now, not to sound like, the Unabomber or Ted Kaczynski, but there is a common theme throughout this video where, like, either whenever someone moves into an area or there's a new human settlement, or specifically, like right after the Industrial Revolution, humans immediately start waging war against nature, like as soon as we had the power to do it. And instead of trying to, find a balance where you protect your livestock rather than going out of the way to exterminate an entire, population. But it is worth noting that like a lot of these extinctions you see because of us getting enough power after the Industrial Revolution to be able to do other things. And it's really weird to see that in the world just in general, and all throughout history. It's like there's a point where animals just immediately start dying because we realize we can really wipe them out. Moving on, we have the coelacanth. So I'm sure you guys have heard of this. This is like the really famous fish that they thought was extinct for like 66 million years. Like they assume it went extinct whenever a lot of the dinosaurs did. And the only reason that we even knew about it is because we found fossils of the fish. And anyways, it has the most insane rediscovery story. In 1938, there was this South African fisherman who was doing this deep sea netting when he pulled up this bizarre looking blue fish that had like limb-like fins. And so he knew it was something special and he gave it to a museum. And this was like the most shocking biological discovery of the 1900s, where they realized they had found an almost unchanged in 66 million years fish that was living in deep like 300 to 1600 foot water. And anyways, it was so crazy because it was like they just randomly found it. Still today, they are very rare. They think the population is possibly as few as like 500. And anyways, I'm sure like if you've played Animal Crossing, you've probably caught this fish. But yeah, insane story. Next up, we have white-tailed deer. So given how many deer, white-tailed deer that you see in the United States, you would probably assume that, this population has always been here, and it's one of the most hunted animals in the United States. Like, it's a staple for us. But you'd be surprised to learn that they nearly went extinct like 100 years ago, really pretty recently. In the early 1900s, we just absolutely decimated these animals because of just rampant overhunting. There was a huge market for their hide and their meat, along with deforestation for farming. And I mean, there was insane accounts. For one example, there was this father and son duo in Minnesota in the 1860s that claimed that they killed 6,000 white-tailed deer between them during their life. And anyways, it was like a cataclysmic 99% decline by the 1890s. Across the Midwest region in the United States, they thought that they had like completely eliminated this species. And overall, the number was probably about only 300,000 left in the world, which for a prey animal is pretty small. But since they have done extensive conservation programs and got the population back up to 30 million, and now that's why, we're able to hunt them today. Hunting is a very big part of conservation. I know a lot of people like frown upon it and think it's bad, but I mean, we kind of do have to hunt these animals because of the gray wolf. It's really important to realize that, one of the main natural predators for deer was completely wiped out by us. And if we don't keep it in check, we could have massive population decline from sickness or habitat destruction because of too much population. I remember my grandpa telling me about how it was probably back in like 1958. He was 20 years old and it was the first time he was able to hunt deer. And it wasn't even in our area. It was like a few states over. I grew up in the Midwest, and it is just so strange to think about animals that you're constantly seeing on the highway or in fields all the time being extremely rare. There are movies that were made back in like the 40s and the 30s where a kid will see a deer and it's like the most rare sighting ever. Like, it's insane that he saw it. And that is a crazy thing to think about, and it makes me very happy that the population is back up to what it is today. Next up, we have tier 2 with the mountain Pygmy-Possum. So this is a silly mouse-looking thing that is a marsupial that has a really funny rediscovery story. So this thing was thought to be extinct for roughly 70 years. They had only discovered its bones in 1895 to prove its existence. And then all of a sudden in 1966, there were some skiers on Mount Hotham in Australia that discovered this strange-looking rat in their ski hut. And I kid you not, they captured it, named it George, and they planned to give it to their 4-year-old daughter as a pet. But then there was this like zoologist, naturalist guy who saw this thing and knew what it was and was like, oh my gosh, you literally have an undiscovered creature that we thought was extinct. Please let me have it. Don't give it to your daughter. Why did you name it George? And so this thing had been alive the entire time, hiding in the mountains where it actually hibernates for 7 months out of the year. And that's part of the reason why it has such a hard time, existing and living, and they're so rare to see. Today, there are fewer than 2,000 left in the wild, and conservationists are worried because its main food source is actually another really weird animal. It is this really big moth thing that can fit in your hand that's like covers up your entire hand, called the bogong moth, and its population is declining as well. But apparently the indigenous people in Australia also eat this moth. And anyways, it's all very interesting. Next on this list, we have the Bermuda Petrel. So this is a bird that was located in Bermuda, sometimes called the Cahao, because it makes this weird haunting nocturnal call of any like seabird out there. Anyways, in the 1620s, it was declared extinct because they had brought in hogs that just decimated their population. And anyways, there was 300 years where there was no confirmed sightings of this bird. And then all of a sudden, in 1951, they found 18 nesting pairs on Nonsuch Island, just off the coast of Bermuda. And they probably had just like completely evaded us as adults spend their entire life in the open seas, and then at 5 years old it returns to its former nesting place and begins to breed. And females only lay one egg per season and mate for life, which is kind of like probably not the greatest for their population. One egg per season, that is really actually pretty unfortunate. Anyways, conservationists have built their population up to about 450 birds as of today. The giant Weta. So this is a giant monster bug looking huge grasshopper cricket thing. In the early 1900s, this thing just vanished off of New Zealand's main islands because of rats and cats and habitat loss. But in the mid 1900s, there was this biologist that was exploring this forest on this remote island at night, and they just suddenly saw one clinging to the side of a tree. And what's so crazy is one of the giant Weta that they just suddenly discovered was so large that it became famous for weighing more than a sparrow. So it was like 71 grams, which is like one of the heaviest insects ever recorded. Next up we have buffalo, or American buffalo. So I'm sure if you know much about American history and the history of the Wild West and the frontier, you've probably seen this picture. This picture shows two men with an almost unfathomable amount of what seems like only buffalo skulls. So to give you some context, there was this extermination program in the 1800s to deliberately destroy the Plains Indians' way of life by exterminating the American buffalo. It is really hard to wrap my mind around how many buffalo they actually killed. The slaughter was so extensive that the population dropped from about 70 million to less than 100 by 1902. Following this, American buffalo were actually so rare that most Americans at the time believed that the species had been completely wiped out. Some of the only buffalo left in America were actually located in Yellowstone National Park in Pelican Valley, and still to this day, this is the only place anywhere in the United States where wild bison have existed since prehistoric times. And currently the population is approximately 20,000. Anyways, I feel like this is like a feature of America that is really sad, that is really completely gone. I kind of feel that they have at least mostly given up on bringing the population numbers back up to what they actually were at, because that would be so many animals. And I also feel like they would be in direct competition with a lot of, first of all, ranchers, but also like row croppers and people just trying to grow food, and it would be kind of a huge threat to the United States economy. And anyways, sad. Moving on to Tier 3, Tasmanian tiger revival. So the Tasmanian tiger, also known as the Thylacine, is the largest carnivorous marsupial of modern times, which means it has, a pouch that it keeps its undeveloped young in to continue to develop outside of the womb. The Thylacine had this weird thing where it could unhinge its jaw, kind of like a snake, to the point where it was like 80 degrees open, which is really kind of weird looking. The last known captive Tasmanian tiger died in 1936. And what's so crazy is the zookeeper that had it didn't even keep records of this thing. I think this guy had assumed that if it died, he would just get another one, and he didn't know that he actually had the last one in existence. Initially, their population declined so much because they were blamed for killing livestock in Australia, which it was much more likely feral dogs that were to blame, because Thylacine's jaws are just too weak to really kill livestock. At least that's what people say. I've never seen one. Anyways, still, even though they are extinct and have been extinct for a very long time, there have since been occasional reports of people allegedly seeing them. Specifically in remote areas such as Western Tasmania, there are different locals and hikers and farmers that report seeing these strange striped dog-like animals in the decades since. If you guys are really into animal stuff, I'm sure you've heard of the wildlife biologist Forrest Galante. He actually did this expedition to try and find the Thylacine, or at least try to track down where people are claiming they have seen ones in recent times because, it's all just rumors. But of animals that are extinct and people are claiming they're still seeing, a lot of people like to say that these are the most likely to still be alive because their range was just so massive. I mean, it was from Papua New Guinea all the way through Australia down into Tasmania. So some tens of thousands of miles of area where it could hide. That is extremely remote and hard to get to. But despite massive reports, we still haven't found any evidence of them really existing still at all. There is this one company that I'm going to be talking about quite a bit in this video called Colossal Biosciences. This company is famous for claiming to bring back the direwolf or create a direwolf clone. They have plans to try and de-extinct a thylacine maybe before the year 2028, so within just 2 years. They say they're going to do this by doing this gene editing and inserting thylacine DNA into another marsupial. And the closest one that they can get to a thylacine is actually called the fat-tailed dunnart, and it's this mouse-sized closest relative to the thylacine. However, a lot of people say this creature won't necessarily be a true thylacine, but rather it will be a fat-tailed dunnart that is an edited version to have thylacine-like traits. But they're saying they may get like a close 99.9% match. Anyways, from reports, they're saying that if they can get close enough to acting and behaving like the thylacine, they're going to try to even reintroduce it into the ecosystem because they really need something to fill the role that the thylacine had in the food chain and to keep the populations of different animals in check. Specifically, the Tasmanian devil that has cancer, and it's an animal that really needs to stay in check because all these weak ones are still alive and giving all the other ones cancer. They have this contagious thing, and that would really help the population. And anyways, imagine we live in a society with thylacines, with Tasmanian tigers. That would actually be super epic, and I love the idea of that. Even if it's maybe not 100% the same thing, if its behavior is similar enough to a thylacine, and it looks like the thylacine, and it's really cool, I think that would actually be pretty sick. But I know a lot of people are, really opinionated on this thing, but we'll talk more about it later. Ice Age pig alive. So this is a hairy pig thing called the Chacoan peccary that was thought to have gone extinct at the end of the last ice age. So around 10 to 11,000 years ago, they thought this thing was gone until they just suddenly rediscovered a small population of it in the 1970s in this area called Gran Chaco of Paraguay and Argentina, which is like this really isolated area. The funny thing is, these indigenous communities around here knew this animal really, really well, and they even hunted it and ate it regularly. And it's just so funny because like Western zoology hadn't confirmed its existence until the 70s when they just found them hunting and eating this pig that was supposed to be gone since the Ice Age. It's not super surprising though, because like I said, this area that they were in is called Gran Chaco. It's often called Green Hell, as it is extremely hard to travel through this area. It is harsh and unforgiving. The environment is often well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's got a lot of dangerous wildlife. And even still today, the greater Chaco region there is largely unexplored. Next topic, we have poison mammal. So this thing is actually venomous, not poisonous. It is a mammal that is only on this island in Cuba in the Caribbean that kind of looks like a mouse, but kind of more like a possum. It's called a Cuban Solenodon, and it was thought to be extinct, with the last one being sighted back in 1890. Now, some people thought there could be a surviving population, and so they kind of recently went in and did an expedition when these researchers suddenly found them almost 100 years later in 1974. The reason they didn't find them is because they live in the most remote southeastern mountains in Cuba, where they live in dense forest at like 2,000 feet above sea level. These mountains are, really hard to access, and they're very steep and have narrow trails. And also, if this animal feels threatened, it completely freezes. So it moves really quietly, and then also will just freeze and you can't see it, and it lives really high where people don't go. And so yeah, perfect combination to be hidden forever. This animal is a very strange creature. It is one of the only mammals that we know of that are venomous. They have these teeth that are like a syringe that it can inject its venom into a target. It can bite humans and do that, but it's not lethal to humans. But it could kill an animal the size of a dog, so don't let your dog go after a Solenodon. This is also one of Earth's oldest mammals, as it's said it lived around the time of the T-Rex, and really hasn't changed at all since then. Under 3,000 humans. So this is referring to, at one point, the human race was reduced to less than 3,000 breeding individuals. This was likely caused by like volcanic winter and the following ice age, and I feel like people don't realize like how bad the ice age actually would have been. That's not a good time. Next up, tier 4 with the Takahe. So this is a large flightless bird from New Zealand that has this strange looking large beak, these bluish green feathers, and it also has these hidden spurs on its wings that it can use for self-defense, which is really strange. So this thing was declared extinct in the 1890s due to hunting and habitat loss, but there was a lot of whispers and rumors of people seeing it still. This explorer, Dr. Geoffrey Orbell, started overhearing about these strange footprints in isolated mountains in these inaccessible regions in New Zealand in 1948 that were larger than any bird known living in New Zealand. And so he put a search expedition together where they spent days searching remote mountain valleys, where after a few days, half a century after their extinction, they discovered not one, but 2 birds still alive. They got pictures of these birds, and since then, conservation efforts have increased their population steadily to 500 today. 11-million-year-old mouse squirrel. So this is the Laotian rock rat. It was thought to have been extinct 11 million years ago. So pretty much in the early 2000s, this biologist was going through this rural food market in Laos, which is this country between Vietnam and Thailand if you're geographically challenged. And they just so happened to see something that was not quite right on one of the vendors' tables. It had the body of a rat, the tail of a squirrel, and a skull that didn't match any living animal. When they looked at it, they thought that it was a complete new family of rodent, but then after studying it later on in 2006, they realized that it was the Laotian rock rat, this thing that was supposed to have been extinct for millions of years. And so locals in remote Laos have been trapping and eating this extinct animal for decades and probably hundreds of years. Science be like, that's extinct. Laos people be like, nah dude, we eatin'. Next up we have the panda. So for thousands of years, people in China knew about the giant panda. We know this because there was Chinese writings and it was a very symbolic animal to the people, but to most of the Western world, it may as well have not existed at all. There was no specimens, no photos, and barely any reliable descriptions of the giant panda. All anybody in the West heard were these strange stories of these black and white bear-like creatures that live in remote bamboo forests. And so because of this, many scientists doubted they existed at all. Actually, the first Western person in the world that really knew about these things was this French missionary in 1869 who was traveling through rural China, and then some locals showed him this strange black and white animal skin that some hunters had gotten, and he was like, oh my gosh, this thing is real. And so he sent this specimen back to Europe, and this is when the giant panda officially got introduced to the global scientific community. Oh my gosh. In the late 1800s, people didn't know worldwide that this thing existed until the late 1800s. By the late 1900s, pandas actually had a serious population problem because of habitat loss, and mainly because they had extremely low reproduction rates. They're just like really weird about reproducing. At one point there was fewer than 1,000 in the wild, but they were brought from being endangered to now just being labeled as vulnerable, which is good. Also, if you don't know, it's probably worth knowing because it's kind of cool. There is this weird thing where China does not let other countries own pandas, and rather all pandas born worldwide are technically owned by China, and zoos will lease them sometimes for like $1 million per year per panda from China. And anyways, they have the market cornered on panda. I guess that's their country's competitive advantage. Moving on to tier 5, we have cheetahs. So at the end of the last ice age, just like humans, cheetahs also went through a genetic bottleneck. Some say the population got as low as only 7 individuals. As of today, cheetahs are so genetically similar that even skin grafts of unrelated individuals often are accepted by other ones as if they are clones. But this also causes bad things such as higher rates of disease and fertility issues because of this, and it's crazy that a population could get that low that they're extremely genetically similar. Great auk witch hunt. So this is a large flightless seabird that's like 3 feet tall. Technically, this thing is actually the original penguin, and all the other penguins that we know of in the world today were named after this thing because they looked like it. Because this thing was very common and lived in a very populated area in the world. Its range was really insane. It lived from Florida in the United States all the way up to Maine, and then over to Iceland, Greenland area, up into northern Europe, and then all the way down into northern Africa, which is so insane to think about this bird that looks like a penguin living in that region. What's really sad about this bird is it was hunted to extinction for meat and fat that was probably pretty good, but also its prized down feathers that were used for things like bedding and pillows. And the reason they were hunted so well and so much to extinction is because they didn't fly, and they were always in really predictable areas. They lived in these groups on these rocks near the ocean, and so hunters could just go out and just take them all out at the same time. The title of this topic was the Great Auk Witch Hunt, and that's because, I kid you not, the last one of these birds that was seen in Great Britain was, no joke, killed because they thought it was a witch. So this thing was captured in 1840, and they tied it up and kept it alive for 3 days until this large storm blew in, and it was really shaking them up really bad. I guess they were close to the shore, and for some reason the guys that had captured the bird started to believe that it was a witch that was causing the storm, and then they grabbed it and strangled it to death. And so anyways, a few years after this incident in 1844, these birds were all extinct. And after this time period, there were many unconfirmed rumors that there may have been small pockets still alive in the Penguin Islands in like 1888. But no one ever verified any of these rumors, and the species was considered conclusively extinct, which is really sad because I feel like of so many different birds and different animals, this one would have been a true gem because we would have had penguins in the United States, just along the coast, and also in Europe, and also in North Africa. Anyways, I gotta stop thinking about the past. Well, I guess I have to for the rest of this video, but it is sad. If Colossus or Colossal is gonna do anything, they need to bring back this bird. That would be so sick. Next up, we have the moa. So this was a larger than ostrich flightless bird that lived in New Zealand that shortly after the Polynesian settlers arrived in New Zealand, the birds disappeared rapidly within 100 years. And that's because they just hunted the ever-living heck out of this thing, and it went extinct around the 1400s, making it one of the fastest extinctions of a whole fauna in history. The main reason this went extinct is because they hunted it as their main food source at that time. But these birds were so crazy. They were huge. They could be up to 12 feet tall. They could weigh 613 pounds. The females, for some reason, were 150 times taller and 280 times heavier than the males. And still to this day, there are different persistent rumors about a remaining flock of these things still surviving on some remote islands. And you might think this is just another one of those, whatever, I'm sure people are just making stuff up. But there was a lot of really serious stories that I heard when I was looking into this. In the 1850s, there was this expedition under Lieutenant A. Impey, who reported these two emu-like birds on a hillside in South Island. And then in 1861, there was this report of a 14-inch footprint with 3 toes that was found by this surveying party that a lot of people think was genuine in 1860. Another sighting was this farmer and his shepherd who in 1878 had this account of seeing one, and then another alleged sighting in Fiordland Bush in 1887. And so some people are pretty serious that this bird survived at least until like 1850 in some like remote side islands around New Zealand. And that is like crazy to think about. Like 400 years later, there's a massive, huge bird that was still around even when we thought they were extinct, larger than an ostrich, the largest bird in the world. Also, Colossal Biosciences is aiming to de-extinct or bring back something similar with similar traits to the moa by 2033, and then even reintroduce it into the environment once again, which is crazy. New Guinea Singing Dog. So this is an ancient canine from the highlands of Papua New Guinea that is known for this unique melodic kind of howling that sounds like a human yodel. Now, there was no confirmed sightings of this thing since the 1970s. There was only a couple hundred in captivity that remained until there was locals that were reporting and sending these blurry photos of these wild dogs that were in the high mountains in Papua in Indonesia. They called these things the Highland Wild Dogs, and no one really knew what they were for quite a while until there was a 2016 expedition that realized that a lot of these wild dogs were actually genetically singing dogs, and they had quite a bit of the same genetic code, so they were the singing dogs. And it's just funny because this is another one of those cases where it's just like one of the most inaccessible mountains on earth has these animals that were thought to have been extinct for quite a while, and so they're still alive today. Like, they still have singing dogs now, and that's really cool. Tier 6, the woolly mouse. So this is not an animal that was once extinct, but rather a mouse that Colossal Biosciences gave this woolly, shaggy, golden, wavy hair that is supposed to be able to handle extreme cold climates, and it's supposed to be just like a woolly mammoth. They gave it woolly mammoth traits to show what they can actually do, and that's really crazy. Next up, we have Ivory-billed woodpecker 2004 sighting. Before I get into this, I just want to say, keep in mind the ivory-billed woodpecker looks very similar to the pileated woodpecker. This is a graphic. They are very similar, but they are not the same. So this is a very large bird. 2.5-foot wingspan, dramatic black and white wings, brilliant red crest. The last universally accepted sighting was in 1944. So it was pretty recent, and since then it is thought to have been extinct. But there is this very famous 2004 video that a lot of people say is an ivory-billed woodpecker. There's just this 4-second frame where you can see something that looks like a large woodpecker flying through this swampy area. Personally, to me, I feel like it could definitely just be a regular pileated woodpecker, but people online are always constantly going on about how it's still out there, the ivory-billed woodpecker is still out there, and they're constantly misrecognizing pileated woodpeckers as ivory-billed woodpecker. And like there's this whole Facebook group where people are like, saw one today, and they got a picture of an obviously pileated woodpecker. Anyways, a big thing is, if this thing was out there, we would hear it. It has a very specific call. And I mean, to me, I actually do kind of do bird watching, whatever, I'm a nerd. But like the main way that, you know, you identify birds is by listening to their call. And you're telling me nobody's picked up the call, but people are always seeing it? That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Once again, if I hear one person say that they saw an ivory-billed woodpecker, I'm going to lose my mind. Moving on, we have the Japanese wolf. So this is an extinct subspecies of gray wolf that only lived in some of the Japanese islands. It was declared extinct in 1905, but since then has had many different alleged sightings. Most notably, there are these pictures by Hiroshi Yaga that this guy released in 1996 that are these dog-like animals near the city of Chichibu in Honshu, Japan. And many people think this is actually the Japanese wolf. And there's even some experts that have concluded that these animals in the pictures closely resemble the Japanese wolf. Despite this, the Japanese government, won't even do genetic testing on these animals out there, even though, there's quite a bit of evidence that people like to point to. And that's because government officials are saying that these are just escaped wolves and feral dogs. And honestly, I don't really know enough to say my opinion on this. I know people are like really gung-ho about these being the genuine Japanese wolves. And maybe, allegedly, it's my opinion that sometimes government agencies might say, no, this is extinct, so that they don't have to deal with keeping up with their habitat or, trying to restore their population. That's what some people think, and it may be me, but next up we have 7 Tasmanian devils. So this refers to the fact that 7 baby Tasmanian devils were born in the wild in the year of 2020, and this was the first time in 3,000 years that Tasmanian devils were born in Australia on the mainland, which is so crazy. This is the world's largest carnivorous marsupial because the Thylacine's dead, and this animal is constantly dealing with cancer that it passes on by biting, and it's a really big problem that these animals have. And if the Thylacine was alive, it would really keep this species in check, taking out the weak ones and the sick ones, and it would probably help this population overall. And anyways, they are very endangered right now, and there are fewer than 25,000 individuals in the wild. Not the Thylacine, the Tasmanian devil specifically. Next up, we have the last tier, tier 7, Barbary lion last photo. So this is the last photo of a wild Barbary lion ever taken in 1925. Barbary lions, also called North African lions or Atlas lions, lived in the mountains and deserts of North Africa from Morocco all the way to Egypt. They are considered the largest lion subspecies as they grew absolutely huge at 660 pounds. They had this really long mane that extended to its back legs, and it's just really weird to think about a lion in the middle of the desert and in the mountains. This picture is actually in the mountains. It was actually adapted to cooler climates, and sometimes, it even was in the snow, which is really strange. But these lions were wiped out from centuries of hunting that ranged from, even like the Romans and the colonial trophy hunters and even just local farmers protecting their livestock. But it's just sad to imagine something being the last of its kind, wandering around in the world looking for a mate that it will never find. Now, while it is sad that this lion is gone, royal families that are from Morocco and Ethiopia have kept lions that are believed to be pure Barbary, but we can't confirm if they actually are pure because we lack the genetic baseline to test this. And so they're either like hybrids with other African lions, or they're not at all, or maybe they are, we really don't know. Entire species under one bush. So this is the Lord Howe stick insect. It is a flightless insect that can grow really large to like the length of a large hand. Sometimes people call them tree lobsters because of this. They were presumed to have gone extinct after rats invaded their island in the 1920s, and its rediscovery story is so crazy. There was a situation in 2001 where these guys were trying to climb this crazy rock formation called Ball's Pyramid. It's this pyramid-shaped rock that's actually the tallest sea stack in the world. Crazy looking formation. And when they were trying to climb this, they looked under this bush, and clinging to the side of a cliff, they saw 24 of these large tree lobsters, stick insects, that they thought had been extinct for 80 years. Anyways, they took 2 breeding pairs back into captivity, and now they have brought the population back up to over 1,000 in captivity. But it's just really funny because at one point there was an entire species of this insect living under one single bush on a cliff in the middle of the ocean. Second to last, we have dire wolf. So I went down a rabbit hole because I genuinely thought Colossal Biosciences had brought back a clone of a dire wolf because they kept saying that they had kind of. If you don't know, the dire wolf is a prehistoric pack-hunting wolf that lived during the Ice Age but went extinct about 10,000 years ago. They were really cool looking. They were slightly larger than gray wolves. I'm sure you've seen them in pieces of media such as Game of Thrones. The Stark children in that show all raised a pup. Anyways, this company that I've talked about before, Colossal Biosciences, in 2024, they extracted DNA from a 72,000-year-old dire wolf inner ear bone and a 13,000-year-old dire wolf tooth, and then they analyzed the key genetic differences between dire wolves and modern gray wolves, which is the closest relative to the dire wolf, and they took a gray wolf embryo and made 20 edits to it to have 14 different genes of similar characteristic to a dire wolf. The main differences are they made it larger and healthier and stronger. It's projected to reach double the weight of a gray wolf. They gave it a more muscular build, enhanced their muscles, particularly in the shoulders and legs. They gave it a wider head and jaws with a broader skull, larger teeth, and jaws that's designed to mimic bone crushing capabilities of the original species. And also they gave it a different colored coat. They gave it a very white coat because they analyzed ancient samples and indicated that it was more of a light colored, white, thick, cold adapted fur. And so they took this embryo and stuck it into a regular large domesticated dog to be a surrogate mother that carried and gave birth to this dire wolf, gray wolf hybrid, unnaturally. And in 2024, the first 2 males, Romulus and Remus, were born. And also they have a younger female pup called Khaleesi, named after the dragon lady in Game of Thrones, that has now joined their pack. They also recorded distinct vocalizations in these pups whenever they were younger, where they produced distinct howls and whines different from gray wolves, they say. But just remember, they didn't necessarily de-extinct the dire wolf. Technically, they are genetically modern gray wolves with dire wolf style genes. So it's a hybrid animal with dire wolf traits, which ironically is extremely more similar to the plot of the Jurassic Park books than you would think, which I kind of think was a big point in the books, but I know a lot of people don't agree with me. Anyways, I have read more stuff about Colossal Biosciences and how they're working to create artificial wombs that would allow them to produce not quite 100% genetically complete dire wolves, but much more closer versions of them to be functional proxies that would possess key traits of the extinct species. But honestly, at what point can it be called de-extinction? Because just with the Barbary lion, can we really know if they are genetically similar, if they've been extinct for a certain amount of time? I personally think it is extremely cool that we are seeing companies try to, do a Jurassic Park, pull an engine, if you know what I mean. Moving on to the final topic, Woolly Mammoth 2028. So this is referring to a plan, once again by Colossal Biosciences, to bring back the woolly mammoth by 2028. I gotta say, I remember when I was in elementary school, I was reading this magazine, and they were talking about how in like 5 years, they were going to have already done this process where they kind of brought back the woolly mammoth. I feel like when I heard that, it was over like 15 years ago, and it just seems like they keep saying they're just 5 years away for the past 20 years to bringing back the woolly mammoth. And anyways, what Colossal Biosciences is going to do is once again similar to the dire wolf. They are not cloning a frozen mammal because there's no intact enough mammoth cells that exist, but rather they are creating a genetically engineered Asian elephant to have key cold adapted traits of a woolly mammoth, such as shaggy insulated hair, really good fat layers, cold adapted hemoglobin, small ears for retaining heat better, a dome-shaped skull, and fat metabolism for Arctic survival. And Colossal expects to produce this mammal with Asian elephants using their embryo by 2026, and even have calves by 2028, which is in, just 2 years. So they better get that thing in there. As the big difficulty with elephants, and probably mammoths are the same, we don't know, is that Asian elephants take 22 months to give birth once they're pregnant. And so they're using an Asian elephant as the surrogate mother. They say they're still on track as of right now, so that would be pretty sick. Even if it is just a hybrid or whatever, dude, that's so cool. I was listening to this one thing about how the reason why they want to bring this back is because the really cold areas and the Arctic and such, they say the woolly mammoth was extremely important in those environments, and they actually created the icy grasslands that they lived in by pushing down trees and stomping on the ice and whatnot to produce these environments. And so, they're very necessary to creating this entire ecosystem. And so people think that if they do have mammoths, they will bring back this ecosystem that once existed, but no longer is as thriving as it once was back closer to the Ice Age. Anyways, this video is about, animals that came back from extinction. There was this thing back in like 2012 where there was this really blurry video that this guy claimed he got. He was in this desolate, relatively unexplored region in Siberia, and it looks like there is a woolly mammoth, with its trunk swinging, walking through a river. This video is actually of a large grizzly bear carrying a great big fish and swinging it around like a trunk. But a lot of people wanted to think it was a woolly mammoth that this guy had recorded out in the wild somewhere that's still out there. And there are people out there that find these really well preserved remains of woolly mammoth and think that they're still out there and that they're still alive somewhere because they were preserved so well in the permafrost. But I will say woolly mammoths did kind of super recently go extinct in the grand scheme of things. What's really cool was there was actually this tiny inbred population of mammoth that lived on Wrangel Island, that is this remote Arctic island off of Siberia, until just 4,000 years ago. There was mammoths alive well after the pyramids were built, which is really crazy to think about. I love animals, and I thank you guys so much for watching to the end of this video, because you probably have the good special interest, which is animals just like me. If you have any specific animals you want Colossal Biosciences to bring back, put that in the comments and I will personally bring it back myself. But if you have any videos you want me to talk about specifically, comment that down below and I might, you know, do an iceberg on that. But thank you guys for 620,000 subscribers on here. You guys are, you know, you guys are doing a good job watching my iceberg stuff, and so I'm just gonna keep doing it. As long as you guys like it and you're still watching it, I'll just keep making these icebergs. What the heck? And as long as you guys like it and you still want to watch the icebergs, I'll keep making them because dude, I love icebergs. Are sick. Anyways, here's my merch. Here is my Instagram. Here is my Instagram if you want to join a group like the Psycho Boys and, you know, give me inputs on what icebergs I should do next and what topics I should include. You can join my Instagram group on there. I also have a Facebook page if you guys want to follow that, but you guys don't have to, for real. Don't do it if you don't want to. But thank you guys for watching. Thank you for being a deranged viewer, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.